week in, week out. And there's a very good reason. I think in all the debate about whether we should be doing this or not, we need to remember that there is a very good reason why we do it, or a range of good reasons why we do it. And the primary one is that it reduces zoonotic risk from toxocara. So toxocara is ubiquitous in cats and dogs. It's present in every continent apart from Antarctica, and periodically throughout their lives, cats and dogs shed toxocara eggs. And those eggs take time to develop in the environment, to embryonate and mature like a fine wine, and then they become infective to cats and dogs, but also crucially to people. We know that regular deworming reduces zoonotic risk through the reduction of egg output from the cats and dogs that we're treating. Another major zoonotic worm throughout Europe and in sort of patchy areas of the UK is Echinococcus. So granulosis in the UK and in parts of Europe, and Echinococcus granulosis's evil cousin, Echinococcus multilocularis, that is now present throughout large swathes of Europe. It minimizes the risk of disease from Angiostrongylus fusarium in dogs. So if we target dogs that are high risk of exposure for this sort of lung heartworm, then by deworming them regularly, we reduce the risk of disease in those dogs. Targeted tapeworming reduces economic losses for farmers. So if your dog becomes infected with tapeworms that can infect livestock, they're not treated, they go for a number 2 in a food bin, or they go and poo all over pasture, then there's the potential that sheep, cattle will get infected and that there'll be economic loss as a result. And of course, fortunately, at the moment, not here in the UK, but in countries that are endemic for heartworm and Echinococcus multilocularis parasites, monthly deworming is absolutely essential to protect the health of dogs in the case of heartworm and to protect human health in the case of Echinococcus multilocularis. Now, fortunately, like I say, we're free of those in the UK. So here in the UK, the sort of basis of our regular deworming is 4 times a year for Toxocara. We know that there's from, well, I say we know from the limited evidence that we have, best evidence that we have at the moment is that 4 times a year, treatment of cats and dogs with Toxocara reduces egg output. Toxocara is ubiquitous. Any cats or dogs could shed at any one time. So regular deworming 4 times a year of cats and dogs will reduce egg output over time. The only exception that perhaps we wouldn't deworm in that fashion are indoor cats. Indoor cats, it's an enclosed system. Yes, they might shed, but they're going to do their number 2 in a litter tray. So with good hand hygiene and responsible disposal of cat feces, we have an enclosed system, and there isn't the opportunity for that zoonotic exposure. But for the others, I would recommend 4 times a year deworming, or testing instead. We'll come to that later. But if we are deworming, you've got your 4 times a year. And then for the other types of worms, so for your lungworm, for your tapeworm, and for increasing Toxocara deworming frequency to monthly, we then need to consider geographic and lifestyle factors. So those geographic factors might be if you're living in an area which is known to be highly endemic for Echinococcus granulosis or for Angiostrongylus fusarium, then you would definitely want to monthly deworm for those. You might be testing and know that E. granulosis, there have been cases regionally or cases of Angiostrongylus fusarium regionally, and that is going to increase that potential risk. You may want to deworm monthly as a result. And then there are all sorts of lifestyle factors. So if we have pets, cats and dogs that are living with young children or with the immune suppressed, we'd want to deworm monthly for Toxocara. if we have cats or dogs that are actively hunting rodents or bird prey, or if they're indulging in sort of scavenging behavior, then we want to treat monthly for toxicara and for tapeworm. And if they're on unprocessed raw diets, or if dogs have access to fallen livestock, then we would again want to monthly treat for toxicara or tapeworm and tapeworm. If we have lifestyle factors such as consumption of slugs and snails, some dogs like to do this deliberately. They see it as a sort of gourmet meal, or accidentally through the consumption of grass or through coprophagia. So, a lot of slugs like to eat poo and then ironically get eaten by dogs that are eating poo. Then you would want to deworm monthly for Angiostrongylus fusarium if we felt that that geographic risk was there, or if they were behaving indulging in these behaviors very frequently. So that in a nutshell, it's a little bit of a sort of oversimplification, but that in a nutshell is risk assessment for deworming. If we don't have heartworm or Echinococcus multilocularis endemic. So then the question becomes, well, if we're doing all this deworming and if we're making a risk assessment, so we're doing our best to not, over-treat, then, why test at all? If we have this ability to routinely treat for worms. Well, there are three very good reasons, in summary. So there are at the moment, very real concerns about blanket treatment. So risk assessment addresses some of those concerns. But, if we could test instead, or if we could increase our surveillance through testing, then we would not need to treat as much. And the treatment that we were doing, we could target down on individuals or groups of dogs. So, it marries in there, fits in there very well. There are countries, say some of the Scandinavian countries, where it just isn't legal or it's not culturally acceptable to routinely deworm. You can't do it without a diagnosis. In those countries, testing is absolutely crucial. It's the linchpin of your control. And yet, it has to be said, in those countries, testing rates, they're not so great. So, just like, we try to encourage pet owners in this country to deworm at-risk cats and dogs. In Scandinavia, there needs to be a drive to increase testing because that is all you have. Without it, you can't use deworming in the cats and dogs that need it. And finally, where treatment is justified after risk assessment. So if you make your risk assessment and you decide that, you are going to treat cat A or dog B routinely, you have absolutely no idea whether that treatment is working if you're not doing any sort of routine monitoring by testing. And there are clear benefits of routine diagnosis. So, if we're doing fecal tests for parasites routinely, particularly for worms, we can demonstrate their presence and therefore a need to treat if they're not already on treatment, or their absence. So, getting a negative result on a fecal test is good. It suggests that either we have adequate control in place or with sufficient negative testing that perhaps it isn't necessary. It allows us to demonstrate the efficacy of the product that we're using, so a lack of drug resistance, but also good compliance on the part of the client. So it shows that the client is giving the product in the way that they should. They're giving it in an effective way, and they're giving it at a sufficient frequency. It assesses geography and therefore risks. So not all parasites are present in all areas all of the time. And crucially, particularly with a lot of dogs moving around at the moment from one country to another, with parasites moving around, it is crucial surveillance for new parasites arriving in your neck of the woods. So just very briefly to remind you what we would be looking for or what we might expect to find if we were going to do routine testing on the feces of a healthy dog for parasites. So primarily what we would be looking for with routine screening is intestinal nematodes. So Toxocara, because of that zoonotic aspect, and because the eggs are shed in the feces, not immediately infective, but will become infective if they're being shed potentially. Surveillance for this parasite is very important. Trichuris vulpis, which is whipworm, not so common in the UK. It tends to be associated with outbreaks in kennels or groups of dogs living in very close proximity where the parasite can build up in the environment. Very important to know if that's there and then to instigate control. And then hookworms. Now, we're sort of kind of blessed again in the UK in that we don't have Ankylostomum caninum, certainly not in any meaningful numbers, which is the more pathogenic hookworm that's commonly found in Europe. We do have lots of Uncinarea stenocephala, not as pathogenic, not the same sort of degree of zoonotic risk, but it can contribute to intestinal disease, failure to thrive in dogs if heavy burdens develop. So again, useful to know whether it's there, and whether our treatment control strategies are being successful. Giardia is an interesting one. If we screen healthy feces, odds are we'll find it. The question is, should we be bothering to include it in our routine panels? What does that really mean for us? We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. And similarly, tapeworms would be really useful to know if they're there in fecal testing. Not always so easy to find them and identify them in feces. And Angiostrongylus fussorum, I put a question mark by this, but it's really, really important to screen for Angiostrongylus fussorum to know whether it's in your locale or not. Feces, though, not always the most efficient way of looking for it. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end as well. So we have a choice, a big choice in front of us when we're looking at control of intestinal nematodes in cats and dogs in practice. The question is, do we use routine testing instead of routine treatment? So do we abandon routine treatment and we just test sufficiently to know if parasites are present? Or do we introduce routine testing alongside routine treatment to monitor its efficacy? And both of them, have benefits, pros and cons. We're going to talk about that now. So this is being debated a lot at the moment. It's in the veterinary press a lot. Some practices are trying to adopt testing instead of routine treatments. And it has to be said that, there is an argument for doing it instead of routine intestinal worm treatment. And indeed, SCAP Europe-wide guidelines offers testing as an alternative for that routine treatment. It's absolutely essential in countries where the routine treatment can't occur. Its advantages is that it avoids over-treatments. So, we don't want to be using any drugs in pets where we don't have to. And where there is an imperative to reduce egg shedding of zoonotic parasites like Echinococcus and Toxocara, you're inevitably going to end up deworming dogs that carry neither parasite. So doing the testing and seeing if something is present there first avoids over-treatment. If we're doing testing, particularly doing a lot of testing because we're doing it instead of routine treatment, it adds to our overall surveillance data and, makes a case for routine treatment being required or demonstrating the absence of a parasite in a certain area. And that in turn informs risk. If we're deworming less, then that limits potential environmental contamination with anthelmintics from cats and dogs. put the question mark there because it is an open question at the moment as to whether contamination is occurring with anthelmintics from cats and dogs. There's been some research into ectoparasiticides and flea treatments. To my knowledge, from cats and dogs, there hasn't been any sort of residue studies or treatments or modelling done. But nevertheless, I think you could safely argue that if environmental contamination is occurring, then treating animals less would potentially reduce it. And then finally, there's the question of whether this strategy would reduce the risk of anthelmintic resistance developing in worms in cats and dogs. And that is, a little bit of a tricky issue, one that I'm going to come back to a little later on. So let's have a think of testing as a replacement for routine treatment. Now, it's absolutely a viable option, but it does need to be done relatively frequently, and it needs to be done with a test that has a high sensitivity. So I have seen, it's been flagged to my attention that on social media and on certain sort of websites, there's been a push saying, oh, well, these clients or these pet owners, they're like testing their cats and dogs like, once a year, Worms R Us lab, or, another sort of external or, sort of small lab. And, these fecal tests are coming back negative, and therefore, they don't need to worry. There's no problem. I mean, the test that you're using needs to be validated. If we're going to use it as a test instead of doing a routine treatment for a zoonotic parasite or one that's going to potentially do harm to pets, we need to know that the test that we're using, is sensitive enough to detect those parasites and specific enough to be getting any diagnostic test correct. So, there are a lot of sort of, independent sort of worm testing labs that are springing up, which, I mean, to a certain extent can be good. It gives people options, but I think it is an imperative on the part of any sort of external lab that is offering fecal testing that, we know what that test has been validated against. We know what its sensitivity and specificity is. And even if we're doing the testing in-house, it's worth thinking about the tests that we're doing and, what the sensitivity and specificity of that test might be, because then we can have confidence in the testing that we're doing. But there is a potential for shedding to occur in between the tests that we're doing. So egg shedding, larval stage shedding is intermittent in feces and tends to happen on and off over time. And that's important because Toxocara eggs particularly are long-lived in the environment. So if they're being shed on and off and we're not detecting it, then numbers of eggs will build up over time. So really, we should be doing it at least 4 times a year to reduce that sort of gap if we're going to do it instead of treatment. That's the sort of frequency that we would have been treating at. I mean, there is an argument that if we were going to deworm monthly for Toxocara, then monthly testing is the most sort of efficient way to try and replace that. But I think 4 times a year is meaningful if we can do that on a regular basis. If you're just, as a replacement for treatment, if you're just testing once a year, even twice a year, you're leaving huge gaps where shedding could be occurring in a 12-month period. There is also inevitably going to be a little bit of a barrier with owners, both over expense and over handling the feces. So almost undeniably, routine diagnostics are going to be more expensive than giving a routine deworming. Whether that is 4 times a year or whether it's monthly, it's going to be relatively cheap to deworm compared with doing these diagnostics. So, we really need to demonstrate the value of why we're doing it if, that sort of compliance and that sort of money is going to get spent instead of a sort of routine treatment that in some owners' eyes is going to do the same job. In my experience, though, it's not so much the money as the handling of the dog feces and just going to that effort to bring the fecal sample in that is the biggest barrier. I mean, we all know pet owners out there that won't carry their poo bag more than about 10 feet if there isn't a bin there to put it in. Never mind lovingly cradle it, bring it back to their car, stick it in the boot, have a half-hour journey with it, practically adopt it, before they bring it to the practice. I mean, I've worked with councils that have sort of, emphasized that there's a tiny proportion of the population that will be quite happy to go out with their dogs at 2 o'clock in the morning so they can defecate unseen and them not have to pick up the feces, rather than, have to pick them up and dispose of them in a poo bin. So, I think if these sort of methods are going to be successful, if we're going to introduce testing instead of treatment, and this is going to be done a lot, even if it's going to be done, just on an annual basis, then, you've really got to emphasize that value and maybe pick your battles with clients that are perhaps keener to do it. So what we don't want to do is for compliance to fall because of these barriers, and then us find that we're not treating or testing for these parasites. It is a bit of a novel concept in the UK. I mean, at the moment, there is still almost no routine fecal testing going on in any sort of organised, routine fashion. So, it's a concept we need to introduce, and whether it be through social media, whether it be through our websites, or whether it be through personal communication in the practice, we need to get across why we're doing this and the importance of surveillance and, sort of routine testing for efficacy, or for whatever reason we're doing it. Clients aren't going to do it if they're not used to doing it and bringing those feces in. I think, whether we're doing it instead of routine treatment or whether we're doing it alongside, practice plans are a brilliant way to bake it in and spread the costs. So, clients will find that they're already paying for it, and they'll think, well, I want to get value for money. I'll perhaps bring this fecal sample in. And I mean, that can be introduced as an option on a practice plan. So practices absolutely don't have to go all in on this and say, well, we're going to abandon deworming tomorrow. You can give people an option on the plan. You can say, look, you could have your dewormer on the basis of a risk assessment, or you could have 4 times a year, routine fecal testing on a plan. And then, people can make an informed decision and decide what they'd like to do. And, any testing that takes place on a practice plan is going to be spread. And, that in itself is very, very useful. So that's testing instead of treatment. But another really useful thing to do is to do your testing alongside treatment. And again, there are very, very good reasons for doing that. So, first of all, it confirms efficacy, it confirms compliance, and, it acts as an early detector for drug resistance if it's developing. So this incredibly handsome Frenchie on the right of here is Stanley, my adopted Frenchie, and there is almost no part of his body that works as it should. It's a complete genetic disaster zone, but what I can say is that almost every parasite in his body is stony dead. And that's partially because of his, living the dream outdoor lifestyle. So therefore, I deworm him very regularly, but I also test him once a year because although, I am blessed in the fact that I could put concrete in Stanley's food bowl and he would just eat it. So, worming, whatever, worming treatment I'm using just disappears. But, there are lots of people who struggle to give these medications. They're not sure if they're giving them correctly. They're not sure if they're giving them at the right frequency. And that's what regular fecal testing does for us alongside treatment, is to confirm that, things are going well. It demonstrates value, so if you are routinely deworming and you've got your testing alongside and your results are negative, that's good news. That's good news. Your client's going to love that. It's the fact that, everything's working, your plan is working, there are no horrendous zoonotic or pathogen causing parasites in the feces. That can only be a good thing. Crucially, this testing as well contributes to local and national surveillance. And that is really, really important in itself. So lots of bonuses for doing these sorts of tests, doing fecal testing alongside the treatment that we're doing as well. So it confirms compliance. Like I say, a negative result should not be viewed as a bad thing. A negative result is a good thing. It indicates that we should carry on as we are. A negative result does not, though, definitely mean we have no parasites. And this is the issue with doing, say, one fecal flotation once a year and going, hey, it's negative, we're all okay. If we were doing it instead of deworming, the fact that, we're doing it alongside the deworming treatment means we can do it less frequently, but a one-off result doesn't mean that we're definitely clear. So, we just have to bear that in mind. But I mean, if we have got an issue, with our treatment frequency or compliance, then that is likely to be picked up over time. If we've got tests included once or twice a year, alongside routine deworming, then if it's an issue, sooner or later we're going to find those parasite stages in the feces. So what if we do? What does a positive result indicate? Well, it may indicate inadequate treatment frequency. So we may be treating 4 times a year and the lifestyle of that cat or dog is changed. It's going out, it's eating everything that moves, it's hoovering stuff off, from the grass, from ditches, it's worrying livestock. We're doing any of these things, and it means that the treatment frequency needs to have gone up to monthly instead of quarterly. So, we've detected that. That is a good thing. And, clients don't often, sometimes, but often don't try to deliberately mislead us. They may not have, really thought about that lifestyle change, or it really have been at the front of their mind. They might not have told us that treatment result from testing helps to sort of focus that discussion and see if increased treatment frequency is required. It may be poor administration. So, if we do get the positive results, we have to sort of sit our client down, put the little spotlight on them and say, have you really been putting this spot on correctly? Has this dog really been getting the tablets it should? Has your cat tried to kill you when you've been trying to administer your stuff? And, probably break down and cry and, confess that, yes, that is the case. In which case, again, no problem. You just need to address the issue. It may be that you need to change from spot on to tablet or vice versa. Maybe that they need a demonstration, but at least, we've identified the problem and then we can burrow down into it. It may be the incorrect dosage. I mean, one of the more common problems with medicines, deworming is no exception, is that the weight of cats and dogs change over time. The weight may have been creeping up, the dose may not have changed, and as a result, we may be underdosing by accident, or sometimes with some clients by design, if they're worried about cost, or if they're worried about toxic effects, they may be giving a suboptimal dose. But if all of these things aren't in play, it is just possible that we may have drug resistance present, and that is naturally a concern and very, very important to detect early. Local and national surveillance is really important, and because it informs what parasites we have, it informs what sort of control we might need to put in place, and crucially, it tells us if something new has turned up. But it also helps to promote further studies. So, we would hope that some of this surveillance may come from the government. And I mean, sometimes, excellent studies do come out. It's fantastic groups like the tick surveillance scheme constantly putting out tick distribution data, ecological risk data, seasonal changes and exposure data. It's wonderful. Sometimes governments are more reluctant to do studies. And, if we can get some evidence, that helps to snowball, it helps to encourage the funding of further studies. So, classic example was back in the days, probably still the case, that they were looking on Guernsey to do fecal testing to find out what the Toxocara prevalence was on Guernsey to help promote anti-dog fouling campaigns and deworming on the island, because, small community, potential zoonotic risk. When they applied for funding, the government said, well, we don't need to do that because, there hasn't been, we haven't done a seroprevalence study in people. There's no evidence that it's affecting people. To which the people who put in the application went, well, that's great. Why don't we do a human seroprevalence study and then we'll need to know, we'll know if there's a Toxocara problem. And they went, oh, no, well, we can't fund that because, there's no evidence that dogs are shedding eggs, in their feces on Guernsey. So, just becomes a circular argument. There's very little that we can do. I would dearly love to have a Toxocara seroprevalence study in people in this country to see how many people are being exposed. There isn't so much we can do to influence that, except generate data that might make an argument for it happening. So, testing and data begets more testing and data. On a more sort of immediate practice, pragmatic level, it helps to raise awareness of parasites that are present in an area. So, that might be in individual pets. We may be finding parasites that we're not covering with our routine treatments. It may be more local, or it may be national. We may be seeing parasites coming into a country that weren't present before. And it helps to generate distribution maps, which are absolutely fantastic. So, whether you're funneling your results, say, into something like SavsNet, or whether you're collating the data yourself and publishing, or making, people aware of that on social media, it helps to generate data that then helps to fill distribution maps over time. And, a colleague of mine once said, we'll love a map, no testing, no maps. So, testing to know where parasites are and in what sort of density is really, really important. As I've said, particularly for surveillance, we need to consider the specificity and the sensitivity of the tests that we're using. So we don't want to, get a false positive and panic people by novel parasites being present, but equally so, we don't want to be missing parasites because the sensitivity of our test is artificially low. And if we get these results and we present them to pet owners, say as part of a study, if they are positive for parasites, their pets are positive for parasites, we need to keep that in context. And, quite often there's a very simple solution, whether it be, treating the pets, whether it be good hand hygiene, it's not the end of the world if individual owners, if they're contributing to a study, if their own pets are positive. One of the things that testing alongside treatment does for us, which is absolutely vital, is the early detection of drug resistance in worms and cats and dogs. And, we have been quite lucky in cat and dog companion animal medicine in that anthelmintic resistance has been slow to develop, much slower, say, than in cattle or sheep or horses. And the reason for this is that, with cattle, sheep, horses, you've got groups of animals that are effectively cut off. They're an enclosed population, and you're intensively deworming them all again and again. And that is going to select for resistance very, very quickly. And that is what we've seen happen. in ruminants and horses, and a lot of problems develop as a result. In cats and dogs, we have large wildlife reservoirs of things like Angiostrongylus, Toxicara, Uncinnaria, hookworm, and that has, really diluted that selection pressure effect. It means that a lot of refugia is being put into the environment all the time and slows down that resistance development. And also, unlike, say a stable or a farm where deworming is very organized, it's got a sort of military type approach, all the animals are being treated at the same time, on time, often quite frequently. In a population of cats and dogs, the approach tends to be quite scattershot, more through accident than design, with a whole range of products being used at different frequencies, and that tends to naturally dilute that resistance developing as well. Nevertheless, we absolutely can't be complacent, and there's been very good examples why not around the world. So far, there's not been any anthelmintic resistance in cats and dogs identified in Europe, but at the moment, there's almost no routine testing going on. We just wouldn't know if it was developing, which is why the testing is so important. I often make this point, but I just can't make it too often, that, if we're testing instead of routine treatments, we are not limiting anthelmintic resistance developing by not treating negative pets. So, by finding a whole bunch of cats and dogs that don't have worms and not treating them, that does nothing to limit resistance. We only limit resistance by finding positive cats and dogs and then deliberately allowing them to shed. So allow refugia into the environment, and therefore slowing resistance developing. There is a real issue in doing that with cats and dogs when the primary parasite that we're looking for, Toxicara, is zoonotic. So we would have to deliberately allow zoonotic life stages into the environment. And there is clearly an ethical issue with that. And I mean, at the very least, we would have to have that discussion with clients and see if they were prepared to take that risk. It's just not, because of the zoonotic aspect, it's not as straightforward as doing that with horses and ruminants, which is one of the major linchpin strategies for slowing down resistance in those groups. In cats and dogs, if resistance is going to develop, it's going to develop because of concentrated worming of small groups of, well, at the moment, it's been dogs primarily. So, for instance, racing greyhound dogs, kennel dogs, where it's just that group of dogs, and people have decided to worm them very, very intensively. And that is exactly what has happened in the US with multiple drug-resistant hookworm was selected for in greyhound kennels. So, really intensive deworming went on with a whole range of drugs. Resistance developed, and then when they retired, those dogs were rehomed out into the general population, and that drug resistance went with them. And that was only discovered through fecal testing. So, that could easily happen in any European country. If we have a kennel where deworming is happening intensely, we have racing dogs where it's happening intensely, breeding establishments where it's happening intensely, the resistance could develop there and then spread out into general communities. And if we're not testing, then we just won't know, be completely blind to that happening until we would be in a very, very difficult position. So that testing is absolutely crucial for early detection to limit that spread. So when do we screen? How much screening should we be doing? Well, I think if we're doing it alongside treatment, then, well, ideally twice a year would be good. But I mean, with clients that have absolutely, no history, no previous exposure to this sort of strategy, then annual to start off with, say at the sort of, when they come in once a year, getting them to bring a fecal sample in then is probably going to be your best strategy. So a bit like with urine sample at the moment, with your health check, it's making it the concept of an annual wellness check rather than a booster, vaccination check. It's just getting people used to the idea, bringing in a fecal sample, getting that tested. As I've said, if we're doing it instead of routine treatment, then it absolutely needs to be more frequent. So, 4 times a year as a minimum. So what types of fecal test do we have available? What should we be doing? Well, can do a direct smear. So you can just get a little bit of poo, mix it with some water or saline, put it under a cover slip and just have a look. For eggs, for worm eggs, that is going to be hopelessly insensitive. It would make a rubbish screen. So, we can put that to one side. There are circumstances where it's useful. So clinical cases, say, of Giardia, probably likely to see some cysts on a direct smear. Certainly for lungworm, just as an initial screen, or in suspected clinical cases, make a direct smear, look for larvae under the microscope. It's got a sensitivity of around 60%. So you're going to pick up around 6 in 10 cases just by doing that. So a negative result tells you nothing, but a positive result, just gets you there very, very quickly. Fecal flotation after centrifugation, that centrifugation step is really important to increase sensitivity, is the mainstay of fecal testing and still very useful. We just need to bear in mind that it does have a varying sensitivity and specificity, partially depending on the skill of the person doing the test, but also just depending whether eggs are present, because shedding's intermittent, and the amount of eggs that you lose during the process. So, it is highly variable. I mean, there was a study done in foxes about, well, probably almost 25 years ago. I think it was maybe 2001, Wolf et al., that compared the actual worm burden in the intestines of foxes that were roadkill that they were looking at, compared with fecal flotation. They found that it really significantly underestimated. So maybe around sort of a quarter for Toxocara, up to a third for Uncinaria. Now, I mean, techniques have been refined a lot since then. We just need to bear in mind that fecal flotation is not 100%. Very, very sensitive tests are PCR, fecal antigen testing, both commercially available now for fecal analysis. Are going to pick up, cases with very high sensitivity and specificity. So, but for routine screening, flotation, PCR, fecal antigen, all good options. We need to remember that fecal testing does have limitations. So as we've discussed, owner compliance, you can only do the fecal testing if you persuade the people to bring in the feces. The sensitivity and the specificity of the test, it's very important to know what that is, so you know how reliable your test is, how many cases that you might be missing. We need to be careful with misidentification of ova and artifacts. So, if we are doing a fecal float and our dog or cat is coprophagic, they may be eating Toxocara eggs from dogs or cats in the poo that have just, are going to pass through their system mechanically rather than them being infected. But also they could eat strongyle eggs from, horse strongyles or ruminant strongyles whose eggs look just like hookworm. So if they're shoveling their way through, tons of horse poo, then, it's very likely you're going to see some strongyle eggs in the feces. It doesn't mean that they're infected. But here also in these images, we've got a grain mite hatching from its egg. Quite often you'll see grain mite eggs in feces, non-parasitic. You'll see plank cases that will try and do a sort of tapeworm segment impression. There's all sorts of things that could be misidentified. I mean, there is now AI available in-house flotation sets that help to take some of that human error out of the system. So that is very useful. We still just need to bear that in mind. Just to very briefly cover Giardia, there's always that question with Giardia. Really common parasites, can cause diarrhea or contribute to diarrhea. So in clinical cases, really important to know if it's there. But the question is, should we be screening healthy pets for Giardia? And if we do, what are you going to do with that positive result? I mean, it's absolutely not recommended to treat healthy pets that are positive unless you're trying to eliminate Giardia from multi-cat or dog households where it keeps causing problems. Or perhaps, if you've got a severely immune compromised person in the house and you're worried about human infection. I mean, it is useful, for national or local prevalence data to know how much Giardia is around, especially in your local area, but it's really not that useful for individuals. It's very limited use as a predictor of Giardia causing future disease. So, there are lots and lots of cats and dogs that are subclinical carriers of Giardia. They might get diarrhea for completely different reasons. So, even if you've tested, you got a positive, and then they develop diarrhea, you would still have to go back, retest them, do a diarrhea workup to try and work out what's going on. Testing really is most beneficial when we've got clinical cases or whether we really are trying to target premises to get rid of it. If we are going to do diagnosis for Giardia, like I say, a direct smear in clinical cases, you may get some cysts, but otherwise we're looking at flotation, which is pretty sensitive. You tend to get a lot of cysts. Admittedly, you're better to get your sample over 3 days because, shedding can occur intermittently. But, if you've got a clinical case, you're going to get a fair amount of shedding. Giardia antigen testing is incredibly sensitive. I mean, you've just got to be careful in interpreting the results because, you can still get positives after treatment, even if the infection's been cleared, and it will pick up very, very, very low burdens. And we now have PCR testing, which again, sensitive, specific. But like I say, again, I would caution you against just testing healthy pets for Giardia, or at least not over interpreting a positive result. Tapeworm, is useful in demonstrating exposure and also geographic distribution of, for instance, Echinococcus granulosus in this country, where, we know it's endemic in parts of Wales. We know it's endemic in the Western Isles of Scotland. There's strong evidence to suggest it's endemic in parts of England and Scotland, but we don't know where. So, testing is very useful for surveillance. I mean, at the moment, there is no test with a high enough sensitivity to detect tinea that is going to replace a risk-based routine preventative treatment approach. It's because the eggs don't float very well. So, they're very, very easy to miss on flotation. So we're still taking that risk-based approach and treating dogs with praziquantel that are in known endemic areas for Echinococcus granulosus on unprocessed raw diets, or that have access to fallen livestock and pasture that those animals might be on. There is now, other tests are being developed. So there's a copper antigen test for Dipylidium, the flea tapeworm. Now, I have to confess, when I first heard that, I was like, well, what is that really going to do for us? Because the biggest thing really with Dipylidium is the shedding of segments, just absolutely revulsing their owners. I mean, that makes my day during a cat spay if a few segments come out, but not everyone feels the same way. But if you're not seeing the segments, what is the problem? But someone has pointed out to me, which is absolutely true, it's a very valid point, that it is a good sentinel for poor flea control. So it does have that advantage. And if you are just missing those segments, then it will identify infection. PCR's available for echinococcus, and that is very important that we do that testing for surveillance. But if we get a positive result, it means immediately very zoonotic eggs are being shed. So it isn't really a replacement for taking your risk-based strategy and deworming those high-risk dogs. And then, the last other group of worm that we have are lungworms. So Angiostrongylus fusarium. I mean, for Angiostrongylus, testing is absolutely essential to establish if we need to be doing routine deworming for Angiostrongylus in our area, so for the wider population. But also, to check that our routine treatments, if we have got high-risk dogs, are effective. So, I would be testing ideally dogs that are on treatment, so once a year, just to check that that treatment is working. We certainly want to be testing dogs with relevant clinical signs, dogs that are going to have surgery because of the coagulopathy concerns, and young dogs. So, when we're testing dogs on treatments, might not be so concerned in my 12-year-old dog, but younger dogs, tend to get infected more, perhaps more of an area where we should be targeting our resources. As I've said, direct smear is a useful initial screen. We can look for larvae with Behrman's, but Behrman's takes time. If we're doing it in-house, it takes up a lot of space, even though I enjoy building them Blue Peter style. And you need pooled samples, so you need to be getting 3 lots of fecal samples to test. So as a screen or as a rapid diagnostic test, blood antigen, so the patient side angiodetect around, depending on the study you read, around about, say, 86% sensitivity, very close to 100% specificity, is a really, really useful screening test for lungworm. And just a quick shout out for practice health plans. So because of their link to parasiticides and a lot of debate at the moment, they've been associated with blanket treatment. They've been, suggested they may be the offspring of Satan. I think that's a little bit harsh. Practice plans are a tool. They're a tool that we hang stuff off that we would like to spread the cost for clients, and that we want to try and improve compliance by putting that regular treatment or testing in place for them. But testing can be incorporated into them, both alongside that routine treatment or as an alternative stream for clients who are perhaps more testing inclined. But ask them, ask them, sort of, put out some feelers, see what people in your practice would like to do, what pet owners that come to your practice would like to do, and where they'd like to spend their money. So in summary, routine preventative treatment for Toxocara has been incredibly effective in reducing, in some countries, human incidence of disease where that's being monitored, certainly reducing egg output and therefore human exposure to eggs. The testing is a routine option instead of routine treatments, but it does have limitations that we need to consider. If we're going to test alongside treatment, that demonstrates value. Testing is really important for surveillance, but whichever approach we take, effective parasite prevention is required. So we have to be careful that people don't drop between the cracks and end up doing neither. We still really need to be doing a risk-based preventative treatment approach for tapeworm because, because of the zoonotic risk and because we just don't have that comprehensive range of tapeworm testing options in place. But Angiostrongylus fusarium testing is absolutely vital for establishing regional risk. And then finally, we have our non-worm Giardia, where, screening healthy pets is useful for prevalence studies and elimination from premises, but not in individual pets. And just a quick plug for ESCAP UK and Ireland, no longer my baby since I went to be chair of ESCAP. It's now in the hands of Hani El Shika, very capable hands. You can still put in queries. If you have any questions about parasites, you can go to the website and put them in. You can follow us on LinkedIn, our little corner of social media empire. And there's also all sorts of useful handouts, maps, and information on parasite control. So I'll leave that up there for you and say thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we've got time for a few questions.
Ian, thank you very much. That was certainly food for thought. And we have got some fantastic questions that have come through. We will try and get through as many of those as we can.
Excellent.
However, before we jump into that, I'd just like to say a big thank you to IDEX, our sponsors for tonight, and also to draw your attention to what Dawn has just put in the webinar chat box, and that is that IDEX has kindly offered an 8-week, no-charge, unlimited trial of fecal antigen tests. And you can find more information by clicking on the link that Dawn has put in the web chat. Ian, we've had quite a few questions, and I'm going to sort of combine some of them together. We're talking about testing. Can you give us an overview of what you tell your clients to do with providing a sample? Over how many days, what temperature, what volume, how must they store it, etc.?
Well, so yeah, I only smile because if you can actually get them to bring it in at all, that is a fair achievement. But yeah, so I tend to not go into the whole sort of temperature or generally the eggs that we're looking for. So if we're focusing on cysts or ova, so intestinal worms, giardia, coccidia, then they're quite happy in the fridge. Keeping them around sort of 4 degrees. They're pretty sturdy. If you leave your feces lying around at room temperature, your hookworm eggs are going to hatch and wander off. Your Toxocara eggs are going to mature, and you're also going to get a lovely sort of mold zoo, growing over the top. So you really need to refrigerate them. Pooled samples are best. So free pooled samples, all in one pot is good because shedding is intermittent. And essentially then as long as they get it into the practice, then jobs are good. It is difficult. I mean, I try and emphasize, why, it would be good for them to do that. But it is, we are at the stage where we're still trying to introduce people to this concept. And so it's a gradual process, and hopefully over time uptake will improve.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed, because as you say, there's so many benefits of it. There was a couple of questions about zoonotic risks and everything else pertaining to the evidence in countries where sort of preemptive deworming is illegal. Is there any, or have there been any studies that shows the incidence of zoonotic disease being higher as a result of those bans, shall we call them?
Oh, that is a great question, and I would dearly love the answer to be yes. But it just governments are just rubbish, really, at doing, sort of good surveillance on parasites that aren't high profile or diseases that aren't high profile. And because to be fair, in their defense, governments have limited budgets, and, seroprevalence studies or disease incidence studies cost money, so there needs to be sort of imperative and drive. So there have been seroprevalence studies done around Europe, and across Europe you're looking at a seroprevalence of maybe between 7 and 10% for Toxocara. But it's not comparing apples with apples. So, different population sizes have been done at different times.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I mean, there hasn't been a seroprevalence study done in the UK for decades. And we just so badly need one for a range of pathogens that probably are just going under the radar and form the basis of routine treatment debates. So parasites like Toxocara or Bartonella, there's just no surveillance for. So at this moment in the UK, how many people are being exposed? it's just, oh, we just don't know.
Yeah, catch-22 cycle at the moment, I'm afraid. Julian wants to know, is it correct to think that a small number of parasites form part of the normal gut biome in dogs and cats and possibly humans?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I think that, if we look at, say, foxes, they are stuffed full of parasites. Very high prevalences with quite high burdens of, say, Uncenaria hookworm, for instance. And they seem to cope with that pretty well. Um, the issue primarily is, well, in terms of pathogenicity, we have worms like Angiostrongylus, which tolerated pretty well by foxes, but the consequences of sort of bad reaction in dogs is potentially very serious. And then, the other problem that we have is the zoonotic aspects. So, low numbers of Toxicara may be, who knows, ambivalent or, good for dogs, but they're not going to be good for us, if
Yeah, yeah.
zoonotic life stages are being shed. So, unfortunately, we have to take the sort of human health elements and the risk of, say, more extreme parasites like Angiostrongylus into account.
Mm.
And I mean, of course, there are, countries, like I say, where, heartworm is endemic year round, or, they have Echinococcus multilocularis, and that does drive monthly deworming for very important reasons.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of Angiostrongylus, Martin wants to know, can it be spread via water bowls if slugs and snails have been in those bowls?
Well, that is another good question. So to answer that, the first thing is, has the slug died in the bowl? I mean, if it's gone for its last swim, then the answer is, yes, because the slug dissolves and the larvae go out into the water. If it's just passing through, if it's just gone for a little recreational swim and then come out the other side, there is some evidence to suggest that larvae may be shed in slime trails. I mean, the work that's been done, was largely on, African land snails that were absolutely pumped with Angiostrongylus and, subjected to different temperatures, squeezed full of Angiostrongylus until eventually they gave some out, in their slime.
Yeah.
So we know it can happen. We don't know its epidemiological importance, but for me, it's not a big thing. If you've had a slug that's wandering around and it's depositing larvae in its slime trail, a dog is just as likely to just eat that slug when it's hoovering up
Yeah,
half
yeah.
the lawn as it is get the larvae from the slime trail. So, it's epidemiologically, I'd be surprised if it plays a big factor.
Fantastic. We have run over time, but I've got one more question from an anonymous attendee, and they've said, in dogs with diarrhea, would you give a course of fenbendazole or would you rather choose fecal analysis?
Well, that is a good question, isn't it? I mean, the correct answer is clearly you should do a fecal analysis. Bearing in mind, there could be a number of things going on, and it's always good to know. And fecal analysis packages are getting cheaper and cheaper. I mean, sometimes cost is an issue, and sometimes time is an imperative. So, have I ever given a 5-day course of fenbendazole? Well, I might have done. I couldn't possibly comment.
Let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that before you incriminate yourself. Ian, we have had a lot of comments coming through, a lot of great questions. We don't have time to get to all of them, but one that I would like to read out is from Caroline, and she says, fascinating webinar. Thank you very much. And
Oh, it's
that
my
really
pleasure.
does sum up my sentiments to you. A